Nikita Khrushchev came to power in the Soviet Union following the death of Joseph Stalin in 1953. He was really kind of a compromise a solution settled on by the Politburo. He was not dearly beloved by them. He was seen as a bit of a clown, but he was also seen as perhaps the best option following Stalin, because the last years of his rule had been pretty tough. Khrushchev initiated his tenure in office by pursuing a policy that he called de-Stalinization, and that's very telling. This is what he called it, and this is what it was all about. As part of de-Stalinization, prisoners were released from the gulags. Some of the gulags were closed down, and certainly the flow of people into imprisonment was drastically slowed. Also, Khrushchev focused in the economy on increasing the production of consumer goods, and this was meant to ease discontent, of course, as you can imagine. And so Khrushchev initiates his time in office in the Soviet Union by trying to ease discomfort, ease discontent, to bring about a greater sense perhaps of security and safety, while still pursuing the goals of communism and communist rule. One of the effects of de-Stalinization was the publication of works in the West, not in Russia, but in the West, of books that were deeply critical of Soviet life and of the communist experiment. And these were books that became very popular in the West. Dr. Zhivago by Boris Pasternak tells the story of a young doctor who's a member of the boyar, of the aristocracy, and the experiences of his family as the Russian Revolution unfolds and as communism is implemented. And it's a great story in and of itself, but it's deeply critical of communism and of the deprivation that people faced as a result of communism. One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich by Alexander Solzhenitsyn won the Nobel Prize, as you can see there. It's a very short book. Dr. Zhivago is very long. Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich is very short, but this day in the life, Ivan Denisovich is a political prisoner in a gulag, and it tells his story, what the gulags were all about, what his life was like there. And so both of these works are taken together, deeply critical of communism, and they weren't allowed in the Soviet Union. They trickled in. Pasternak and Solzhenitsyn were expatriates, but they became very important in the West. Okay, you can see that Solzhenitsyn won a Nobel Prize. Dr. Zhivago was made into an award-winning movie. It's beautiful, beautiful, very long, very beautiful movie, a compelling story, and it gave Westerners this look into communism and into life behind the Iron Curtain. What does this have to do with de-Stalinization? Is even though they were outside the Soviet Union, Pasternak and Solzhenitsyn lived. Okay, they made it. De-Stalinization and Khrushchev's apparent lightening of the iron grip, if you will, did lead to an uprising in Hungary, a revolt in Hungary, their pursuit of being let out of the Warsaw Pact and to being able to pursue anti-communist reforms, if you will. Imre Nagy, and please forgive me if I'm saying this wrong, led this effort. He was a communist, and he was the president of Hungary at the time, and there was discontent in the Hungarian population, and so kind of taking note of that discontent and wanting to advance Hungary's own recovery from the war and their economic position, Nagy pursued economic reforms to open up their economies, to be a little bit more free market type of reforms. And seeing the success of those and with the way in which they were received by the people, he next demanded that Hungary be let out of the Warsaw Pact and be free to pursue their own foreign policy out from under the thumb of the Soviet regime and out from under the thumb of Moscow. This led to a full anti-communist uprising in Hungary. You can see here in Budapest in Hungary, a statue of Joseph Stalin has been taken down by the people, and his head is there laying in the street. So this is pretty telling of what the Hungarians were wanting in 1956. Militias of Hungarian citizens, both military and not, came to the forefront, and they called themselves the Freedom Fighters. I think this picture is very telling. We'll see in a moment that the Soviets, the Russians, responded really strongly to this uprising, which went on for quite a bit of time and became quite violent. But they took to the streets. They called the Hungarians, they called themselves the Freedom Fighters. This was a full rebellion against communism, and they sought the active support of the United States in this. They sought the support of the United States. And the American president in 1956 was Dwight Eisenhower, who had been the general in World War II in D-Day. And he expressed support for the Hungarians, but refused to offer anything besides words to this effort. And this is significant. Remember, containment and this whole policy and this very delicate dance that the Americans and the Soviets do during the Cold War, that they are not wanting to go to war with each other, and Hungary was technically behind the Iron Curtain. And so while in the United States there was great support for Hungary and they were cheering for him and everything like that, it became kind of controversial that it was just words. It was just words. Eisenhower would not commit troops or supplies or money or anything like that, that this effort was something that the Hungarians were going to have to undertake on their own. Khrushchev moved to crush the rebellion, and he really kind of took this to heart, that his kind of loosening of things under de-Stalinization should result in this, and he wanted to make an example out of them and say, this is not where we're going to go. And so sadly, the Hungarian revolt was really dealt with quite harshly, and the Soviet tanks came rolling into Budapest. Freedom fighters were killed or arrested. Nagy sought sanctuary in a Catholic church. The Catholic Church played an important role in this, because the communists didn't force the closing of Catholic churches in their satellite states, because Catholicism was deeply important in a place like Hungary. However, in Poland, of course, but communism and Catholicism were never on friendly terms in these places either. So Nagy goes to a Catholic church and he seeks sanctuary there, and the Soviet tanks kind of rolled right up to the door of the church. You see here in this photograph the people out in the street, the tanks coming through. A man pretty high up in the communist government of Hungary, János Kadar, went into the church where Nagy was, and he essentially persuaded him to give up. He gave him promises of his safety and the safety of some other people in his government if he were to give up sanctuary and to come out. Now, these were false promises, as it turned out. Nagy accepted Kadar at his word, and he left the church only to be arrested and later executed by the Soviets, who were kind of standing right there. And Kadar went on to be implemented as the president of Hungary, communist president of Hungary, which is a position that he held until communism fell in the late 80s, early 90s there. He was never beloved by the people, and I would say never trusted by them or fully forgiven by them. But I think that this is an interesting moment. Kadar, from what I have read and from what I've been able to understand, was really motivated by not wanting any more violence to be brought against the Hungarians, and he saw kind of giving Nagy up as being essential to having Khrushchev call off the dogs, if you will. And so they were certainly in kind of a tough place. But the United States, while expressing, again, this is part of this delicate dance that happens, Hungary was behind the Iron Curtain, and so they didn't mess with it beyond kind of expressing their support. Khrushchev ended up dealing with this situation in quite a heavy-handed manner, and the uprising in Hungary was put down. In 1957, the Soviet government, much to the astonishment of Western Europe and the United States, launched the first successful launch of a satellite into space. It successfully made it into orbit, and that was called Sputnik. And as you can see here, a nice photograph of it. And this added to the already existing arms race and kicked off what was known as a space race between the United States and the Soviet Union. They went into great efforts to try to outdo each other with space technology. NASA was born, and those kind of things started to happen. In the early 1960s, there were also in very, very intense moments of confrontation between the East and the West. And I love this cartoon because of nuclear buildup and because of the arms race. We stood on the brink, and in the early 1960s, historians and political scientists even talk about foreign diplomacy between the East and the West being a game of brinksmanship, a game of chicken, because of the prospect of nuclear wars. You had two nuclear armed countries. The prospect of hot war between the United States and the Soviet Union directly, between NATO and the Warsaw Pact, was annihilation, okay? That any war between them was going to escalate to nuclear war. And so I think that this cartoon illustrates that very, very well. They're in the guillotine and they're holding each other's ropes, okay? So if you drop the other guy's rope and you move and you're going to decapitate, the Soviet Union is going to decapitate the United States. The consequence of that is that they're going to be decapitated too, and there is no way around it. Mutual annihilation, okay? Mutual annihilation. But in the early 1960s, there were moments of intense confrontation between East and West that put the world very much in fear of nuclear war. The first of these was centered in Berlin. Berlin remained a problem for the Soviet Union because it remained free and it remained open and it remained a gateway to the West. And in the early 1960s, estimates put the number of people fleeing the Soviet Union through Berlin, through West Berlin, at up to 1,000 a day. So this is not some kind of tiny little obscure issue. This was a very, very serious issue for the Soviet Union. And Khruschev, through their diplomatic channels and moving the West, is like, you've got to stop people from doing this. And the Westerners would make kind of very, evasive promises like, oh yeah, we'll try to help you out with that. And so the trickle was becoming a flood. And Khruschev was also, this is a problem for him, and he was also aware of how important Berlin was to the West, okay, and how especially to the Americans that they were kind of all in on Berlin, that he had to force the issue, if you will. Khruschev had a reputation for being a little bit of a jokester or a class clown, if you will, and he, to put this rather bluntly, but rather on point, Khruschev remarked once that Berlin was the testicles of the West, and if he wanted to make the West scream, all he had to do was to squeeze Berlin. And in August of 1961, he squeezed Berlin, and the West screamed. Residents of the city of Berlin woke up early one morning to find that the Soviets had started constructing a concrete wall straight down the middle of the city. So you can see here pictures of the wall and of its construction, and you can see how it is being constructed from the east. It's being constructed from the eastern side. Now, the reason that the wall was being constructed was to stop the flow of people from the Soviet Union into the West. It was too much of an escape route. Khrushchev, however, lamented publicly, and he said that the reason for the wall was to stop Westerners from infiltrating the Soviet Union, that there were too many people who wanted to escape capitalism and democracy and come to the East. Now, interestingly, there were expatriates from England and France and the United States who wanted to go, who were communists and socialists, and they chose to go to the Soviet Union after the war. So while those communities absolutely did exist, the flow to the East was in no way comparable to the flow of refugees from the East to the West. And so this wall was really meant to keep people in. The wall essentially barricaded the city. You have to remember that Berlin lay wholly inside East Germany, and in fact is very, very close to Poland. And so Berlin is wholly inside communist-controlled territory. And so this wall was very, very much a barricade. And the wall, you can see here, it really cut Berlin in all the way around the city. As it was under construction, people were still able to briefly communicate, even though it was remarkable. It was kind of like an instantaneous cutoff. If you were on the wrong side of the wall, on the day that it was under construction, families were separated. They couldn't talk to each other. People couldn't return from one side to another. And eventually the wall on the eastern side and the Soviet side became heavily fortified. I always found it very interesting. You can see here in this photograph that there was eventually barbed wire put on top. But look, these people on the west, they're able to walk right up to it. But on the east, it ended up, like I said, becoming highly fortified, and you couldn't walk right up to it. It was dangerous. People were executed in attempts to cross the wall. There were places, of course, because there had to be where you could pass from one side to the other, but these became very, very few in number and were heavily guarded military-run checkpoints. The most famous of which was at the Brandenburg Gate, which is this famous kind of Berlin icon that you see right there, and you can see that it's on the eastern side. It's behind the wall, and there's Checkpoint Charlie that you could go through. And so while it was possible to pass from one side to another, it was not something that could be undertaken by just a regular person. Okay, you had to demonstrate who you were, what was your reason for going there, etc. It became a very highly fortified border. I love this picture. It's the only reason it's in this PowerPoint. I love this picture because I love weddings, and I find, and I like how you can see the fortification leading up to the wall, and it just kind of juxtaposes the happiness and hope of marriage and of this couple with look at the, you know, kind of the tricks and the you know, barricades and the barriers that were used to keep people away from the wall. And this is, of course, on the eastern side. On the western side, the whole existence of the wall, you could walk right up to it. Now, the West Berliners, when this wall was under construction, they screamed. This was a crisis in the Cold War, and there was the demand that the United States do something, help these people. Don't let him build this wall. This is so amazing how, I guess, prescient this topic is right now. But Kennedy, the American president in 1961, was John F. Kennedy, and he felt very strongly that he had to do something. He made a lot of speeches. He did say, "We are all Berliners." That's what Kennedy said. "We are in this together." This is a huge part of the Western response to the Cold War. And so NATO went into action. They told Khrushchev to stop. Okay, and the world kind of hunkered down and braced for war. And what happened was that NATO tanks and NATO helicopters. They amassed outside of East Germany, and they rolled through East Germany, and they came into Berlin, and American and NATO tanks rolled right up to the wall. They made a big display of force, but no shots were fired. Again, this very, very delicate dance, this kind of game of brinksmanship and of chicken. Khrushchev dared Kennedy to shoot. He kept building the wall, and the American president made a very big and loud statement, say, we don't like this, but the other hand, backed off. And just to keep things fun and interesting, the next crisis emerged very quickly the following year in 1962, and it's the Cuban Missile Crisis. And this is probably actually the closest that the world ever came to nuclear war. In 1959, Fidel Castro had staged a successful communist revolution in Cuba. This horrified the United States because Cuba was so close to the U.S. They were rather mystified that communism could emerge somewhere so close. And the Cuban Missile Crisis was all about the discovery of the installation of missile launch sites in Cuba. So in 1962, American spy planes discovered that the Cubans were constructing missile launch sites, and it was believed, and this turned out to be correct, that these launch sites were meant to launch nuclear warheads that were Soviet nuclear warheads. It's another photograph of the launch sites. These were under construction, and this was indeed a matter of an emergency for the United States. Now, this was in response to the existence of American nuclear warheads that were installed in Turkey, which was very close to Russia, and the Russians, justifiably felt threatened by that. The Americans felt incredibly threatened by the existence of such close-range nuclear strike capability. And so we have to remember that in the technology of the space age, etc., the Russians had the ability, of course, to bomb the United States from Russia, but they would have to use a plane, or they would have to use some other technology that would, while the nuclear bomb would still be incredibly devastating, it was going to take it a minute or two or an hour to get there. Whereas these missiles and launched from Cuba had an incredible strike range and a matter of minutes. A strike could happen in a matter of minutes, not in a matter of hours. Okay, and a much broader strike range than existed if they were having to fire from Russia. Some men in President Kennedy's cabinet wanted to attack the installations, wanted to fly planes over and drop bombs on the military installations in Cuba, on these missile launch sites. But Kennedy rejected that, and what they did instead was to institute a blockade of Cuba, a naval blockade that was supported by air power. And the purpose for the blockade was because American intelligence had come to know that there were ships inbound from Russia carrying the Soviet nuclear warheads. And so this was kind of like a last chance. We're not going to go drop a bomb yet. The United States and Russia really didn't want to come to war. They didn't want to come to blows. And so here's a game of chicken. And the word went out. And something that's super important here is that Kennedy and Khrushchev lacked the ability to speak directly to each other the whole time that this was happening. Okay, they managed to kind of get the word over that if the Soviet ships attempted to pass the blockade, that the United States was going to fire. Hot war was going to start. And so everybody waited. Everybody sat around for a few days and waited for the world's biggest game of chicken to kind of come to its conclusion. Well, sorry, I thought I had another slide here, but I don't. And what happened was, at the last moment, Khrushchev turned his ship around. And so it was Kennedy who blinked at the Berlin Wall, and it was Khrushchev who blinked in the Cuban Missile Crisis. and the missile launch sites were dismantled, and everybody went home. Khrushchev was almost forced out of power in a coup during that event, and his tenure in office came to an end shortly thereafter, I think around 1964. Leonid Brezhnev became the premier of the Soviet Union, and he was a bit more hard line than Khrushchev was within the Soviet Union itself. So Brezhnev took a hard line within the Soviet Union itself, but did not experience the level of crisis with the West that Khrushchev had. And Brezhnev had a reason to implement what he called the Brezhnev Doctrine, which was that the Soviet Union, Russia, would respond forcibly to any attempts to undermine or overthrow communism within the Soviet Union itself. And he had his great opportunity to implement the Brezhnev Doctrine to show he was serious with an uprising in Czechoslovakia that became known as the Prague Spring. Okay, Czechoslovakia in the 1960s was governed by a man named Antonin Novotny, and his nickname was the Little Stalin. And so this tells us that he was incredibly heavy-handed and was not a nice guy. In 1968, which was kind of a crazy year all over the Western world, and this is just one manifestation of that. We'll talk about some other things that happened in 68, but one of the events that made 1968 kind of a crazy year was the Prague Spring, and the Prague Spring was an anti-communist uprising in Czechoslovakia. And this started very much as like an intellectuals uprising. The Prague Spring is sometimes called a writers' insurrection, if you will. And this was about the freedom to express ideas, any ideas, not necessarily anti-communist ideas, but for writers and actors and playwrights and directors to have more ability to say what they want to say, to publish their works. They're not talking about necessarily criticizing communism, even though a lot of them were deeply critical of communism, but just the idea to create their art, the means to create their art. And so this starts as kind of this intellectual movement, but eventually it brought people out into the street, okay, this idea of supporting them. And so the army was sent out, the Czech army was sent out to stop this uprising, to disperse it in the Prague Spring. But as you can see here in this photograph, the Czech army went to the people. And so here's the people, they're standing on the tank. You can see the flag of Czechoslovakia. If you notice, I know it might be kind of hard to see, but take a look at this flag. It's the flag of Czechoslovakia. It's not the hammer and sickle of the Soviet Union. And so this brought about a greater crisis. And of course, Brezhnev, in pursuing his doctrine and taking a hard line against this, sent Soviet tanks into Prague. And they forcibly put down the uprising. There were arrests and there were deaths and there was violence, and the Prague Spring was forcibly put down, and communism kind of firmly reinstated in Czechoslovakia. This picture to end with, the woman crying, holding up a picture, not sure of whom or of what, but you can see kind of the smoke and the people in the street and the looks on their faces kind of defeat. And so the moment had not yet arrived.